Welcome back to the GCSAA TV live stage. I'm your host for this next session. My name is Adam Miller. I'm an agronomist with the USGA and director of our education and outreach program. We've got an awesome hour-and-a-half plan for this panel discussion, touching on really a new trend in the industry and something that I think is extremely important. And it's all around data management to maximize performance of your putting greens. So we've got a fantastic panel. We're going to touch on all the different components of surface management and using data to maximize performance of your greens and maintenance efficiency as well. Before we get into that, I wanted to quickly announce the 2022 Green Section Award recipient. This is an award that the Green Section and the USGA presents every year, and it recognizes someone who's made a tremendous contribution to the game of golf through their work with turfgrass. And some recent recipients include Dr. William Meyer, Michael Huck, Tim Hires, Dr. Norm Hummel, and Bruce Clark. This year, we're excited to announce that Frank Doby, who's a 6-decade superintendent and general manager at the Sharing Club in Ohio, is our recipient. Frank was instrumental in mentoring more than 30-plus turfgrass professionals that have gone on to very successful careers in the industry. And he was also a pioneer with a lot of different innovative ways to maintain golf courses. He holds a couple patents and really dabbled around in the golf course maintenance equipment industry. And then probably one of his biggest accomplishments over his time was he really led the fundraising efforts around the Musser Turfgrass Award for Excellence. And that award recognizes really the top PhD in turfgrass research each year and gives them a tremendous amount of sort of startup money as they're moving on from a PhD into the world of academia. So really excited that Frank Doby unfortunately couldn't be here today, but excited that he is our recipient for the 2022 Green Section Award. So I wanted to introduce our panel. We've got really a rock star group up here. Most of you probably know who these folks are. But again, going to be a great discussion and looking forward to talking to these guys today. So we'll start with, on my left, we've got John Sorokin. He's a turfgrass professor at the University of Tennessee. He's done a ton of great research, very involved with practical applied research that helps golf course superintendents sort of deal with their day-to-day issues. And specifically, he's done some work recently on things like frequency of clip and brushing, different mowing patterns on both bentgrass and ultra-dwarf greens. Next on the panel is Jared Nemitz. He's the director of golf and grounds at the Ford Field and River Club in Savannah, Georgia. He's really been a pioneer in the world of collecting putting green data, using clippings to help make decisions on his golf course. This is something that he started back in 2009. After that, we've got Brian Whitlark. Brian is a senior consulting agronomist with the USGA, visiting golf courses throughout the West region. He's also part of our research committee, with a big focus there, obviously, for Brian would be on water use, things like that, but also, again, to make sure that our research program continues to focus on the applied type of research that helps golf course superintendents day in and day out. And certainly, last but not least, is Zach Nicoludis. He's also a USGA agronomist. He's in the central region, working with courses throughout the Midwest. Before joining the USGA, Zach was the South Course Superintendent at Wilmington Country Club, as well as several other notable courses in the Mid-Atlantic region. So I think you guys would agree our panel has a ton of practical experience. We've got research experience. Like I said, really a rock star group. So great understanding of sort of the nuts and bolts around putting green management and using data to collect on collecting surface performance indicators to maximize the potential for your greens. So let's get started, and really before we dive into the data collection and clipping volumes and all that, I wanted to start and talk to you, Brian, about what is sort of the definition of putting green surface management? What are we talking about when we use that term? What cultural practices are included there? And then maybe what are some things that you wouldn't consider to be a surface management practice, just so we sort of set the table as to what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I don't think there's a hard, real definition, but in general, I would say it's your day-to-day management of putting greens for mowing, rolling, brushing, grooming, vertical mowing. I think that's kind of where we're going to focus our discussion today, on those aspects of surface management. I think you could argue that Certainly irrigation and even organic matter management, because they are so influential in how a surface performs day in and day out. So again, it's a little bit of a gray area about that definition, but in terms of what is not included, I would probably say aeration, solid or venting tines, hollow tines, sand injection, air injection. I probably wouldn't include those in the surface move. But if anyone has a different definition, by all means, I'm curious to see what you have to say.
In terms of you touched on the mowing of greens. Obviously, that's something that we have to do day in and day out. 6-7 days a week. Some courses will go even more. Zach, talk to me a little bit about some of the new trends you're seeing with mowing equipment being used out on putting greens. For instance, triplex mowers versus walk mowers. What are some trends that you're seeing in your region?
I would say definitely we're starting to see more triplex mowing. Obviously, the labor issues are probably a major factor there, but I would also say we've seen significant improvements in triplex mowing technology in recent years that the quality of the surface that's produced is equal to that of a walk mower. Outside of that, then you get into the reels, obviously, 14-bladed reels, and then just the overall setup of the mowers. And I mean, ultimately, so many things, it's about finding out what is that right combination for your particular golf course. There's not a cookie cutter approach, so it's about taking a good idea and fine tuning it to make sure it's right for you and your facility.
Yeah. Definitely agreed. Triplex mowers seems like they are, the true definition or the only ability to really do more with less that I see on golf courses where you can match quality would be with the triplex mower. Obviously, being so much more efficient. A lot of times you can have one triplex mower and that can do the same work as 4 individuals with walk-behind mowers. So, question for the group here.
It's funny with triplex versus walking. We sort of we fall in love with striping, and you think about walk mowing and you think about the stripes. They're so beautiful with the walk mower. But if we take that out of the equation and you just look at quality of cut and obviously efficiency, then man, the riding mowers are the way to go. And there's some greens that are too small, to really effectively turn a triplex mower. So some courses just make sense to walk, but man, by and large, the walkers, you get every bit as good of a surface and you can spend that labor somewhere else.
I would also add with the triplex mowers, if going from walk mowing to triplex mowing, you can see a pretty quick return on investment if you have to purchase or lease a new triplex mower to update to the latest version. On top of that, it gives you more flexibility. It's certainly a lot easier to triplex or double cut with a triplex versus double cut with walk mowers. I know when I was at Wilmington Country Club, we frequently, I would say anytime we double cut on the South Course, we were using triplexes. Greens average 8,500 square feet, and we'd have to send 9 employees out to walk mow when we can double cut with 2 triplexes. It's a no-brainer when it comes to that.
Yeah.
We did a lot of economic impact work when we did the work this is back in 2005, 2006, and we did the alternating mowing and rolling, and we compared and surveyed the superintendents all in Tennessee. How many of you triplex, how many of you walk mow greens? And we got the economics of how much cheaper it is to actually triplex mow greens. And our research has shown that there's no difference in the quality of cut with new triplex mowers versus a walking greens mower. And if anything, it's actually less of a footprint on the green actually walking is the higher footprint traffic than the mower itself.
Absolutely.
And it's the turnaround. Obviously, it's if you got a good area to turn around, that's where you get the challenge on the collars or just off the collars. But other than that, it's on the green surface, it's an equal cut.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm at a pretty high-end facility budget-wise, and we use triplexes in conjunction with walk mowers. During the wintertime, we try to do more walk mowing just with the level of traffic and turns on the collars and things. But when we start getting into good growing degree days and, weather's on our side, we're triplexing a lot. Because with Bermuda grass, we have Tiff-Eagle greens at the Ford Field and River Club, and it's all about cuts. And if I can get more cuts on those putting greens and not have to increase the labor, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The name is slipping me, but there was a superintendent in the 80s and 90s in Michigan that a lower budget private course, but he was triplexing his greens, and a couple members were mad and said, you need to be walking them. So he took out the middle reel And then when you go down, you come back and you staggered, it looks like you've walk mowed the greens. You get that mowing
Yeah.
pattern that you want. But it was like he was triplexing, and he just couldn't afford to walk. So
But to your point of the technology of the triplexes, I mean, we're getting to the point now where you can mow with 2 reels on the triplex. You know, you can go to do a cleanup with only 2 reels on or 1 reel on. I mean, the technology is getting so much better with triplexes. And I mean, with the labor market the way it is and the way things are going budgetarily, I mean, I don't see us going away from triplexes. It's going to keep going more and more.
Yeah.
I agree.
The economics that you mentioned, John, and we've got actually a mower decision tool, mower sort of calculator to determine your return on investment, what you would spend on walk mowers versus what you would spend on a brand new triplex. And we've seen when we run those types of models, the ROI can be just a couple of years, especially in scenarios where you're doing a lot of mowing of your greens. So the perception, like you mentioned though, John, with hey, you know, the stripes look nice, or you know, some others think, okay, high budget courses, that just is the norm, that they're going to these walkers and not using the triplex mowers. We've actually got data, we've surveyed over 350 golf course superintendents of varying ranges of their budgets as to what are you using on your golf course most often. And it was pretty surprising to see that really of the higher end budget courses, only 17% were exclusively walk mowing. So there was still, there's this notion that, okay, I'm a high budget course, I can afford it, you know, walk mowers are the way to go. It just doesn't seem that like that's really the reality for so many courses. So what do we think needs to happen? This is for the group. What do we think really needs to happen to convince more courses to utilize triplex mowers?
I think it's, you know, education and talking to people. And the other thing is having a really good equipment manager. You know, one of the knocks on triplex mowers sometimes is they overinflate the tires. And if your tires are overinflated and you do that cleanup pass, and everyone probably out there can know, and you do that cleanup pass, you get those tire marks. So, and that's only because the tires are usually overinflated. So you got to make sure, you know, just like you do your mower setup every day, check the tire pressure of the triplex mowers, because I see it, because it varies with temperatures. As it gets hotter or whatever, tires can inflate, and you got to make sure that they're not overinflated, because that causes the little ruts. And sometimes I talk with a lot of golf courses that have them do the cleanup pass with a walker. So you got someone that goes around and does the cleanup pass with a walking greens mower. They can do 1 or 2 even with the walking, but then they triplex the rest of the green. That's just, you know, one of those things.
So Zach, question for you. So that's an awesome tip with the overinflating the tires, or, you know, trying to reduce that. What are some of the other common concerns around triplex mowers? Like how are superintendents overcoming those challenges with, you know, avoiding the triplex ring, or hey, I've got really steep fall offs, I've got bunkers that are really close to the green, you know, triplex mowers just aren't right for us. How are superintendents sort of overcoming some of those challenges with triplex mowers?
I mean, the one when you talked about whether it's turning or just or staying off the collars and stuff like that, I would say I've seen some courses where they mow a pass, lift up, back up, mow a pass, lift up, back up. So it eliminates any striping concerns. You know, you're not going to have that aesthetic appearance of the wider stripes on a putting green. You know, Jared talked about, you know, 2 reels being on to mow a cleanup pass. I've even seen a superintendent that it was, you know, 2 reels were set for the cleanup pass, 1 reel was set for the collar, and they buzz around like that. I've seen a number of courses when it comes to the collars. I mean, you know, one way of avoiding any collar issues is to get rid of collars. Seen a number of courses just go no collars. We just hosted a USGA championship, the Senior Open at Omaha Country Club, where they don't have any collars on those greens. So, and then you get into segmented rollers. If you are doing the walk mowing, that certainly helps reduce that shearing force created by the roller as the cleanup pass is mowed, and then. Lost my train of thought there. With that and then even going down going down the road of what the cleanup passes are walk mowed. You know, when labor's an issue, maybe you don't walk mow them in the shoulder seasons when the turf isn't under as much environmental stress, but then you only walk mow them maybe June, July, and August. You know, talk about that a lot in the Midwest. Just you've got more labor then, and you can afford to do the walk mowing on the cleanup pass then.
So 2 follow-ups to that. getting rid of collars, that's a newer trend that some courses have done. I'm curious to get the take from the group. Mower turning, walk mower turning, and collar damage associated with that. Whether you're using turning boards to minimize that. How do the triplex mowers, when people are turning those, what's the impact on the collars there? Do we think they are sort of equal to walk mowers, or is there less potential damage with mower turning on collars? What are you guys seeing?
I'd say, as long as you have area to turn the riding mowers, certainly less damage on the collars. I don't see many courses using the turning boards. That's a lot of labor involved with that. During championships or during events, that's typically the only time I see courses using turning boards. Yeah.
I would say a lot has to do with the skill set of the operator to not, if they've got to do that, 3-point turn, and they maybe potentially are starting and stopping on a collar. Obviously, they have to understand how sensitive it is that they don't spin that tire or really, step on the gas there.
I mean, most of the time when you're using a triplex, just getting it off the collar, doing the big teardrop turn way out in the approaches or the fairways or the rough, it really eliminates a lot of that traffic issues. I don't really see a lot of the traffic issues on my collars, only on some pinch points where we have to do the 3-point, 4-point turns with a skilled operator.
I just agree with all that. I think it's about operator training, and the fact that you're actually triplexing, you're getting those greens mowed a little faster. So I know you're trying to stay ahead of play, but you're not in a race either. If it takes a little bit longer to do that swooping turn instead of spinning it around, 'cause, a lot of people that are mowing greens, they want to get them done as fast as possible, and that's where the problems are. So it's good training of the operators for sure.
Now let's shift a little bit into some of the cultural practices that we touched on, like brushing, grooming, like vertical mowing, or some actually call sort of vertigrooming. I know that's a term you've used, Brian. So I'd like to get the group's opinion on sort of how these practices are used on the grasses that you're seeing in your region. Is there this is balancing the art and science, obviously, of greenkeeping, but is there a specific practice, frequency, strategy that you think seems to be working a little bit better than others?
I like to use the term a lot of a little. I like to take the trash out all the time, so I like to do a lot at very light intensity, light frequency, high frequency, low intensity, excuse me. So, nothing aggressive, but do something all the time. Brush, groom, verticut on a very frequent basis when the grass is growing to help train it to stand upright. And I mean, that right there, to me, is a diversion from the way we used to manage in my area, Tiff dwarf or ultra dark boom grass greens. It was sort of gouge and recover was type of, let's see how much material we can hog out and put in the workman. And, it was sort of a badge of honor, see how much material you could haul off a green. But then you're recovering for 6 weeks, and then you put a bunch of nitrogen out to try to recover, and you honestly end up going backwards. You grow more organic matter than you harvested anyway.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle over and over again.
Absolutely. So just do something often. Every time you go mow, do something at light intensity to train that grass to grow upright. And I don't know if we want to get into the details yet, Adam, of those, but.
Yeah, so I love the concept, high frequency, light intensity. So I guess for the group, describe typically what you see with the greens the day that these types of practices are performed, brushing, the vertigrooming, or the light vertical mowing. Are they instantly better, smoother, increased speed, or does it take a little bit of time for the greens to sort of even out and you see those benefits a day or so later? What are you guys seeing out there?
I think it's all about the process, doing it when you're doing it light and frequent. It's not about seeing the results that day, but it's about over time, when you're constantly taking out the trash every day, you're never letting the grass get ahead of you. So when you're out there and you're double cutting today, you're going to see that benefit over the next few days, and you're constantly just removing that little bit of grass. So once again, I'm on Ultra Dwarf, and it's all about doing something to it every day. Whether it's vertigrooming, which is setting the verticutters, or the groomers, where it's lightly touching the blade of grass, getting that grass to stand up. So when you mow over it, you're getting a little bit more grass than you would be getting just with a normal mow. But we vertical groom, which is that light verticutting. We do it 2-3 times a week. through the growing season. And then when we're not growing, we do that maybe once a month when we're dormant, just to try to keep that good, smooth texture. But it's all about how to stay ahead of the grass, but the golfers are never going to notice it. That's the big difference. I mean, when I started in '09 on Bermuda grass, it was the gouge method. It was the set the verticulators low, get as much grass in the Cushman, right? And then you go over it, and you got stolons sticking up. It was bumpy. It's wobbly. The ball wouldn't roll very well, and the golfers knew we were doing something. If you do these light, frequent practices, the golfers never know that you were there, and that's the point.
It just helps to avoid those peaks and valleys in the performance of the greens with that. I mean, if you're not going out there like you guys said, if you're not doing the Bryson DeChambeau bomb and gouge, and you're just kind of out there just slowly doing everything, it gives you the opportunity to fine tune frequently. It's like, and when we have more tools than ever to go after managing the surfaces, whether it's as aggressive as you want to go, or to dial things back and be just to be something that just something to just do a little bit to the surface.
Yeah, it's just that moderation, like we're saying, everything in moderation, but always being you're out there every day and you're looking at, you make a slight adjustment, definitely on the different time of year, as things are changing throughout the summer. All of a sudden it starts getting stressful and hot. If it's bent grass, you might want to back off on some of these because they're just being too aggressive. Because definitely doing a lot of out front brush work, a lot of frequency clip work, and all sorts of grooming and vertical work, and we've done backtrack, double cut, perpendicular cut work. Bent grass is a completely different animal than Bermuda grass,
Yep.
and in the transition zone especially, where we are, where it's high stress for sure.
Yeah, I was actually going to shift into that to sort of talk about bent grass and the plant health perspective part of it, because obviously you're wanting to get the best possible surface, but you can only push so hard, even if you're going at that high frequency, light intensity. So, Brian, obviously from the brushing perspective, you're seeing courses both with bent grass and Bermuda grass. How are some of these brushing treatments sort of impacting health? If they're getting a little too aggressive, or what are you seeing from a speed perspective with brushing? Dr. Kaminsky did some work on brushing in a short-term study, and the results were a bit surprising. I think we saw decreased ball roll because of that, and lowered bent grass quality. So with bent grass in your area, and then maybe followed up with a discussion from you, John, and Zach around bent grass in your areas, how is that holding up with some of these brushing programs that are out there?
I agree with everything in Kaminsky's study, actually. So it was a 2-week study. They looked at some different different brushes, and essentially the ball roll speed slowed down, and turf quality went down. Yeah, in a 2-week period, when you start brushing, absolutely, the greens are going to be slower. And more than likely, the greens are going to get worse before they get better. So brushing is a long-term strategy. It takes a while, whether it's Bermuda grass or bent grass. I've seen the similar results. You just start light, and over time, it will get better, but it kind of gets worse before it gets better. And absolutely, if you're brushing the day of a tournament and you want fast green speeds, I'd pull the brushes off, because the greens are going to be slower the day that you brush, unless you mow and brush in the afternoon and then mow without brushes in the morning, which is something we did on bent grass greens at the Senior Open in Oklahoma. As far as, there's out front brushes, there's gear-driven brushes.
We go to 230?
Chip Howard has a booth over there. Dr. Howard has a really nice out front brush system. We're doing okay with time?
Yeah, so we go to 230.
Yeah. So those are great brushes. Again, he has different stiffness levels, whether you're on bent grass or Bermuda grass. I haven't seen damage from brushing, even on bent grass. Now when it's 110 in my area, we're generally pulling back on the brushes, but nevertheless, the take-home message for me is start at light intensity, and it's going to take some time to train that grass to stand up. And mow, attack that grain in multiple directions. The most aggressive, with an out front brush, your most aggressive direction is going to be uphill because the grain is growing downhill. So to start off, if you're worried about scalping or being too aggressive, then mow cross slope. That is the least aggressive direction for brushing or vertical mowing or grooming, is just start with mowing with those practices cross grain. And as the grass gets a little bit more trained, then you can go into the grain and down grain. For the gear-driven brushes, I personally, I really like the Greens Perfection brush. Rodney Lingle is a good buddy of mine, now down in Texas. Done a tremendous amount of work on brushing, and that's a phenomenal gear-driven brush. You can set it with a groomer gauge, and some like to sort of eyeball it. I'd much prefer to get the groomer gauge out and have your mechanic measure that brush height. When you start in the spring, start at about mowing height, equivalent to mowing height, and then the brush can go down to maybe 70 to 90 thousandths above the bottom of the rollers is a pretty good guideline where to set those gear-driven brushes.
John, let's move into sort of some of the research that you've done recently on frequency of clip and adjusting that. So give us kind of an overview of what the research says around how adjusting frequency of clip impacts trip performance and speed and overall health. And then I'd like to get the group to sort of chime in as to how often are we seeing superintendents adjust frequency of clip?
So yeah, so we did several studies on both bentgrass and Bermuda grass looking at frequency of clip and at different mowing heights as well. So we went from 80 to 110 and 150, and then we had 3 different frequencies of clip. So right there's 9 different mowers, and we did this at University of Tennessee on bentgrass and also at Michigan State at the same time. Tom Nicolai was doing it on bentgrass too. Then we also did it on Bermuda grass, and what we found was we've had these trends of going from 11 bladed to 14 bladed reels. Well, that's because the mowing heights are getting down to 80 where you're mowing, so that the engineering of the mower setup, the clip a reel determines your mowing height. And so you have to, at those low mowing heights, you have to get an increased clip a reel. But increasing the frequency of clip, we've actually seen absolutely nothing happen. We didn't get an increase in clipping yields. You do after the first couple days, but it's kind of like that brush study. After 2 weeks, it's equilibrated. So that would be nice to see those studies go beyond 2 weeks, or on doing these things, because these greens equilibrate after 2 weeks. And then that frequency of clip, you didn't pick up more yield than you did at any of the heights of cut on Bermuda grass or bentgrass. The only thing we found by increasing frequency of clip was every Monday we'd do a light sand top dressing, and when we come back on Tuesday to mow, we picked up more sand. So you had more sand in your buckets and more wear and tear on your machines, and you spend all that money for sand. It's pushing that sand in the bucket. So the frequency of clip actually didn't increase anything. And we've compared that to that study, but we also did a study looking at where we did the backtrack double cut, and then a perpendicular cut, and then a single cut, and then a single cut with a increased frequency of clip. And basically the backtrack double cut and the double cut perpendicular picked up more clipping yields and gave you, but again, higher frequency of clip didn't do the same as doing a double cut in our replicated research on either species.
So the frequency of clip, I guess, in my experience, we initially see higher clippings, and it takes some time. I think it takes 3 to 6 weeks until you see, this is a bit subjective, but an improvement in the architecture and the texture of the greens. Now that's debatable, maybe, but I think there is some value in the higher frequency of clip. Now, a single cut with higher frequency of clip versus a double cut, I'm with you. I'll take the double cut, and you better pull them. You better not use that high frequency of clip after sand. I'm with you 100%. There, it's just it's a fan, right?
Yeah.
You're just shoving that sand right into
So implementing the brushing, frequency of clip, grooming, vertigrooming, all those different practices that sort of are bundled into that surface management discussion. I mean, it is so much of an art. Knowing when to do something is maybe sometimes just as important as knowing when not to do something. So when we pull in sort of the data side of things, trying to create more science to help you make some of these decisions, like I wanted to get into this part of of data collections is sort of, you still have to have the art, but as we pull in more science, it just helps us make, more informed decisions around our greens. So, let's start with data collection, service data collection. Zach, other than soil moisture readings, is green speed the most common piece of sort of performance data that you see superintendents, doing on a regular basis to get a feel for performance of the greens?
I would probably say, yeah, putting green speed. And it's, you don't see everything from testing multiple greens or testing one green. I mean, the reality is figuring out what way of measuring putting green speed, and not a different way of measuring, but how frequency or how many greens that you do every day. What works for you? I mean, obviously, anybody that's done it knows it's not a time-consuming process, but it's just, I think, being consistent with what greens you test and when you test them, and just using that to gauge how your greens are performing. I mean, obviously there can be a lot of user error when somebody, or not, there can be some variability depending on who's checking the putting green speeds, but I mean, given what's out there right now, that's really the best metric we have as far as gauging how putting greens are performing, and then also evaluating everything we're doing to putting greens every day and what can be done to improve performance and ultimately turf health.
And the Stimpmeter's always been a pretty controversial tool. It's been designed to help with consistency from green to green, but it has obviously, been looked at as something that's contributed to the arms race, so to speak, with respect to faster green speeds, and it's always a polarizing subject, and so maybe that's one reason why some superintendents don't measure their green speed. But Jared, I wanted to throw, this is a little bit of a tougher question at you. Chris Triplex from Hazeltine National has been pretty outspoken recently about sort of his changeover from initially really using the Stimpmeter as a doorstop, and that was it, to now moving into something that he checks his greens every day. So I'd like to get your take as a superintendent. Why do you think so many superintendents either don't stimp their greens or just don't record the number itself? They check it and, okay, I know what the speed was that day. So kind of a two-part question there.
Well, from the superintendent's point of view, I think what happens and why some people get maybe intimidated or start looking at the Stimpmeter as a bad thing and use it as a doorstop is more of that the guy down the road says he's got 13. He's rolling 13s, 14s, and my golfers are hearing that, so they're comparing my golf course to the other person's. And you start getting into the arms race of, well, I'm going to be 13 today, I'm going to be 13.6 tomorrow, and you just keep pushing, pushing, pushing. And the Stimpmeter wasn't designed for that. It was designed for consistency on your golf course, green to green, and that's what it should be used for. And I think we're getting past the mantra of chasing the green speeds down the road. I think we're starting to get back into using it as a tool to say, are my greens staying consistent week to week, month to month? Because my golfers don't really care that they're going to be 12 or 14. What they want is to play every day and have that consistent speed day to day. They would rather have 12s every day or 11s, just be consistent. Don't give me a 13 today and give me a 10 tomorrow. So they want that consistency, and that's where I use that tool to really give me that one data point are my greens staying consistent? Am I in the ballpark? And then I can use it as a communication tool to my membership to say, we're on target today. We're within the expectations of what you want. So, I don't post the Stimpmeter readings at my golf course. I don't tell them, but we list it as days within the range that we're desired.
How many greens do you measure?
So on a daily basis, we measure one green.
One green.
But then periodically we'll go out and we test one on the front, one on the back, and then one at the practice facility, just to kind of see where we're at. And then right around tournaments, we host the Georgia Open, and we will stimp all the greens every day in the morning and evening, just to kind of make sure that we're staying consistent for that tournament.
So when you measure all the greens, what do you find out different than when you're just measuring one or two greens?
So when you're measuring all of your greens and you're actually comparing your green speeds across your whole golf course, you'll find that there are sections of your golf course that are very different. We have 4 greens on the back 9 that are just so much slower than everything else. And we know that, we've learned that from the data, so what we do is we will go out there and we'll give those greens extra cuts, extra rolls, or even during the wintertime, those greens are the slower greens, so we put an extra roll on it when we roll all the greens, so we'll just double roll it. But you start to find that your greens are, they're all in their separate sections and their micro environments. And when you start taking data and you start really looking at things like from that perspective, it really helps you go into that next level of management to say, maybe this green doesn't need a double cut every day. It's in the shade, it performs well, it rolls the same as this other green with half the effort. And so, I mean, one of the big takeaways that we do is we always send out a mowing sheet. Our greens do not just get single cut or double cut. We will write on each green 1, 2, 3, 1, skip. And that's how that starts to come back. When you start using the data, it starts coming back to you on ROI, and I know we'll talk about that later.
Oh, good.
Oh, good. I just don't like that speed's the litmus test that we're using to measure greens a lot. It's firmness, uniformity, consistency, trueness of roll. Roll out. If a lot of things are doing that now. Speed's an adjustment, and obviously it's good that they're not chasing the other courses as much anymore because, as you're trying to chase that speed and get faster greens, what are you doing to get there, and are you compromising the trueness of the roll? Because if you're lowering your heights to get those green speeds and you get more ball marks, more damage, more foot traffic, then the trueness of the roll and the actual putt isn't as good, and the consistency of that putt. So I like to look at the measurements, and I see all my students down there because we're going over putting green management right now on cool season putting green management at school on Monday. But it's doing all those things to get it. And I think, Mike Morris at Crystal Downs Country Club is, in my mind, one of the best superintendents out there, and he's taken control of that, because they got old Alistair McKenzie-shaped greens, and if you're trying to get those speeds for those few members that want them really fast, you're taking off a lot more members than you're making by making just those 5% happy. So he took control of surveying his greens and got all the members to identify, what's the ideal green speed, and it was between 9.5 and 10.5 on the stimp meter. And like you, he doesn't post his things, but on the first tee, you can see today, the idea, it's decided by the members of Crystal Downs Country Club, the ideal green speeds are between 9.5 and 10.5 on the stimp meter, and today they are at, above, or below. Because you can't do it every day, obviously, if it's been raining or whatever. And it says, if you would like to know what the green speeds actual are, please contact, Mike Morris, your superintendent, so he can know what members want to know that, and he can communicate with them. Because that's the key, is communicating with them of why do they want to know.
Well, and you're alluding, there's a missing part of the data collection is the stimp is telling you one thing. It's how far that ball is going to roll on that line. But there's the whole, is it wobbly? Is it, are you getting that bumpiness? And that's when you have to, the putter is my number one tool, but it's so subjective.
Right.
It's subjective. I'm having to look at that ball and, okay, so it's rolling 12 today, but it's hopping.
Yeah.
Would you rather be on 11 that's smooth and the ball never leaves the line, or would you rather have 12 and the ball's rolling all over the place and wobbly? And so ball rail distance, it's one part of the whole, data taking. Right.
We're trying to start to do some video capture and look at that and see if you can look at that wobble and trueness or how it's going to veer off pattern.
At a golf course I worked at, we actually did that same survey that Mike did at Crystal Downs and that Tom Nicolai talks about in one of his books. And it was interesting. We did it over 2 years, and just some takeaways from it. During a stretch of really dry weather, we actually intentionally did less to the greens to produce a slower green speed to see if the perception would be that they're faster because their ball's hitting at the front of the green and rolling through the back of the green because of firmness. And the perception was the greens were faster when they were firmer.
Right.
So that's a huge part of it. And then also the influence of weather over our ability to manage green speed in the range that was more or less identified that we thought the members would want before. So we had a really hard summer the first year, and we were about 72% that we were in that range that we had identified. And we had probably one of the mildest summers the following year in the Mid-Atlantic, and we were 95% within that range. So it just gives you an idea of the ultimate X factor is going to be Mother Nature and determining how putting greens can perform from that
Nice.
perspective, from the putting green speed perspective.
It's nice because at Crystal Downs, the membership had a thing just after they did that and said, might be like you to slow them down. So it's actually now between 9 and 10, but 9 and 10 at Crystal Downs on a big undulated green, 10's fast.
That's plenty of speed there.
You lose pin placements as you get faster, right? So yeah.
So sort of continue along the line of data collection. Obviously, I think we all agree there's value in measuring green speed and recording that green speed, and whether or not you share that with anyone, it's still a good performance indicator to keep track of. The newest trend is really collecting clippings and looking at clipping volumes. And Jared, that's something that you've been doing, correlating clippings with performance really since 2009. So how did you get into putting green data collection specifically on clippings? And then what decisions are you making based off of those clippings and green speeds, things like that you're taking each day?
I mean, that's a great question. I started in 2009 and started small with small amounts of data, and then it's kind of grown from there. But it was for two reasons. That it was communication to the membership, and it was communication within our management team. And both of those things they impact what we can do on a day-to-day basis. And so one of the things that happened was, as far as management goes, I remember Nelson was the superintendent at the time and I was the assistant. And we're a little turf nerdish, okay? I mean, I think that'll come out as we keep going here. I love this stuff, I love data. But we're looking at the walk mowers going across the greens, and we're talking about what we're going to do and what we did yesterday and how it's impacting what's going on right now. And he looks at that bucket and he says, yeah, looks like we have a lot more clippings than yesterday. And I looked at the bucket and I said, that looks like a lot less clippings than yesterday. And here you have the two decision makers who are trying to plan out, are we being successful with what we're doing? Are we going in the right direction? Is what we're doing today what we want? And yet we can't even have a conversation about what we're seeing because it's so subjective. And so right there, it was like light bulb went off. That's a measurable thing. When we were in grad school, we measured clippings. Why can't we do that on the golf course? And so that brought that to the forefront and started that for me. But then the other part of it, and I think everybody who's superintendent's in the room right now, one of the biggest challenges is communication with our membership. What do we hear all the time? They don't understand what we do. They just don't get it. Well, what are all those people in the room? They're all business people, and they all understand numbers. They understand the black and the white and the red. They all understand it. And when you present data to them on a table and shows this trend line going down or up, everybody in that room can say that's good or bad. They can all see it. And that was the big thing for me, was especially being young and being young in the industry, trying to get them to understand what we were doing and what the value in what they're giving, the money that they're providing to our budget, where is it going and what is it producing? And so those are the two reasons I got into it, and it's been very, very successful to bridge both those gaps.
And what types of decisions are you making off of that clipping data, to help your day-to-day? Like once you and Nelson started to really dive into it and learn your clipping volumes, how did that influence things like PGR applications or fertility applications or even top dressing?
Yeah, so when you start doing it, if you're not doing any type of data collecting and you start, it doesn't help you as much right out of the gate, because you're learning what your greens are telling you. You have to start to track it and see these trend lines. But over time, over weeks, over months, over years, you start having the data sets that come in with your stimp meter readings, your how much top dressing you're putting out, how many cuts, clipping volumes. You start to, all of a sudden, it changes. You are no longer reacting to your greens. We're not making decisions going, oh, we double cut and it wasn't the right move today, we messed up, or we should single cut tomorrow. All of a sudden, it's all proaction. You're ahead, because you know that in April, the greens are gonna wake up, they're gonna start growing really fast, and you need to drop the heights, get that clipping volume up, get that old grass off as quickly as possible. But you don't know that if you're not seeing that data set over the years start to develop. So, I use it for fertility. It helps give me that idea of, is the grass growing too much? I know that threshold over time, how much clippings I want. And if I have above that, I know I have too much fertility, not enough PGRs, or I'm not mowing enough. And you can start to really dial in some of those practices. And the thing is, it all starts to come together. The greens will tell you that what's coming year over year. One of the most interesting things from my, I don't know, was it 14 years of data now, is that the greens do the same thing every year. They don't vary. I mean, we're talking within 10 to 14 days. Pythium weather, April 4th. I mean, Pythium starts to creep in right around that time frame. So all of a sudden, you can plan your chemical applications. Let's just put it out on April 1. Let's call it good. Let's not battle that Pythium outbreak. So that's how I use it. I use it to help me get ahead of the greens and not being so reactive.
So have you done like any growing degree day stuff and with what you're seeing in growing degree days, and then all of a sudden trying to, now you can give it another advance, maybe this is going to give you an indicator, now you need to get ready to do this, or each year might be a little different by a couple of weeks, right?
I played with growing degree days. We did it for a whole summer, and I just never was able to get that dialed in with the ultra dwarfs.
Right.
I know it's very, very successful, and with bent grass, I just have not been as successful with it on ultra dwarfs. But that's just probably user error too.
Right, maybe.
So the clipping volume, part of things, and this is where you're taking something that came from a research, practice, and moving it into the field. So it's imperfect. John, obviously, when you're doing clipping volumes and at the research level, trying to get things published, you're using, you're drying it with ovens, trying to get absolutely just the weight of the clippings themselves. So superintendents aren't going to have time to, dry their clippings to really dial that down. So I'm curious, any tips sort of how superintendents can that they're collecting clippings can maximize their consistency with what they're doing out on the golf course?
Yeah, I think it's just measuring the volume. Like, when they go and they dump it in the back of the Workman or the Cushman or whatever, and you just look at it, and maybe put some tape on the sides and you put it in a little box that you dump it in to see what's the volume you're getting off of each green and how different is it every day. I think that would be more of it. I kind of cringed when you talked about measuring clippings because it brought back horror stories of my graduate student days, and I make my grad students do all that, and yeah, like you said, we do it, but we also separate the sand from it too. So we collect our clippings and then we float them and then we measure get the sand that comes off. So, I think there's practices, and as we got into this micromanagement and these things, on that day after your maintenance Monday or whatever, do as little to the green on that Tuesday as possible so you don't disrupt that sand top dressing you've put in, because it's, because you pick up a lot more sand than you realize when you mow on a Tuesday. So for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think sometimes superintendents will get into we can't do it like the researchers. We're not doing 8 replications or 5 replications on 4x4 plots, and you don't have to. You don't get lost in how to do it. Just be consistent with what you do, and then that's going to help you. Because once again, we're not trying to compare down the road or compare to somebody else. You're trying to learn what your putting greens are doing, and if what you're doing to them is working and getting the desired result.
So if you move to a new facility, Jared, you've got 14 years of data. If you move to a new facility that had a couple years of data, what would be the sort of 2 or 3 things that you would really need to dive into that data set around? Assuming they're collecting clippings and green speed, that kind of thing. What would be the biggest 2 or 3 things you would want to know with that data set?
Well, we talked about it. The clipping volume and stent meter readings are pretty important. They're 2 very good tools that I like to use to help make my decisions. But one of the third one that I think is sometimes overlooked is that journal. How many times did you mow the greens? How many times did you groom them, verticut them, roll them? That's the type of stuff that starts to lay out an expectation level. Because if you go into a golf course and let's say the greens are in, it's a rescue situation. Well, you don't want to keep doing what they're doing. So if they have some of those data points, you can start saying, well, man, they just mowed them to death. They mowed 400 times last year, and there's nothing left. And you can say, I need to start there. Let's start backing off our mows. But I really think that just tracking what you're doing and how many times you do it is really good, because it helps with what I just said, but it also helps budgetarily. And you can set up where are you going, how much labor is going into each of those things, because all those things add up to dollars and cents. And when you're called in to defend your budget, when you start slapping up numbers of cuts and verticuts, you can ask them, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? 25% budget cut? You want me to cut out 25% of the mows? Are we ready for that? It starts to change the conversation. It goes back to you're talking to business people, and if you can change the dialogue and get on their level, you can start winning a lot of those battles that we can lose by just saying it won't be good.
Adam, let me just jump in for a second. So I agree. I think clipping yield and green speeds. In some courses I work with in Southern Nevada and in Arizona, that's what they're every day. It's some amount of clipping yield and green speed. And it was interesting talking to them in kind of preparation for this. Number one, they said, my green speeds are just more consistent day to day and year to year, making decisions based on that information. So they got rid of the swings in green speed. So, I mean, that's a big success right there. Another one was, they said, over time, and to your point, Jared, this doesn't happen over weeks. This happens over months and even years. They were able to really reduce their nitrogen inputs. A couple courses in Vegas I talked to, super just, I'm down to only about 2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot per year, where formerly I was double that. And I just realized with this data that they found a happy place for their amount of clippings per day, and they determined how much nitrogen they needed to get there. And they realized that they were over applying nitrogen. So they really reduced their nitrogen risk. And then secondly, they were able to reduce their mowing. So rather than mow every day, they realized they were just over mowing the greens, and all this data, led to that decision. So they went to mowing and rolling alternatives. So now they're labor savings. So I mean, to justify the minimal time of collecting this data is minuscule compared to what some of these courses has achieved with their performance and labor savings by using this information.
So Jared, collecting the performance data, 52 weeks a year, 7 days a week, that's a lot. That takes a team effort. That's something probably not that you can just do all by yourself. So how do you make sure there's sort of buy-in from your whole staff, to understand the importance, and maybe it's just sort of your leadership staff or whomever is, checking the greens and emptying those buckets to actually give you the chance to then measure them. How do you make sure there's buy-in, and then how do you recommend someone getting started into the, clippings?
The number one pushback that I get from people when we talk about this or we start getting into it and I try to help set up some data collection for somebody, the biggest pushback is I don't have time. I hear that's the number one pushback. I don't have time. And to your point, it's we don't have time, but you have to have your supporting staff around you. We all have staffs, and my staff, my management team, and myself are all part of this process. So I can't spend 30 minutes in my office just clicking in Excel. That's a waste of my time. But when we have a team around us, so for instance, my staff member who goes to the putting green every day, that's where he's going to start mowing that green. It is part of the SOP for them to take the 5-gallon bucket with them. They go, mow it, put the clippings in. They bring the bucket at the end of the morning back to the office, and then the assistant grabs the bucket when they come in from their morning shift, weigh it real quick. The bucket's already tared. The whole process takes 30, 45 seconds, and then the next person puts it into Excel. So there's 3 people that are all working on one data point, and it's all those 3 people adds up to 1 minute, 2 minutes apiece. Cool. And it's not just me, it's not just the management team, but it's the entire staff that's doing it. Even with volumetric water readings, TDRs, the staff's out there getting those numbers and recording them. Mm-hmm. So it's a team effort. Everyone puts a little bit of time in it to get these big numbers and big data sets, and all of a sudden they get it when I've showed my green committee meeting presentations to the staff and my management team, and then all of a sudden they can see what their work is producing. So once again, it's just a great communication tool, and everybody's involved.
And your leadership obviously is a big part of that. I mean, that's just part of mowing greens is that's the process that you got to do. So that's a testament to your leadership of training your employees to know that you're not just done when you mow the greens, but this is the next step that has to be done to these things. And that's.
I haven't taken a stimp meter reading in probably 2 years, and we have it for every day. But that's not my job. That the assistant in charge is out there, and he takes the stimp meter readings. and then I'm putting right behind him, and we talk about the results and if we're heading in the right direction. So it's about team effort, communication, and everyone buying into an overall result.
So Brian, when you talk to a golf course and you hear the, maybe pushback isn't the right word, but the greens are in a good condition and they're fairly content with their process of just sort of eyeballing the clippings. What do you say to that superintendent, sort of why you think there's still the advantage of collecting clippings when things are pretty good?
Well, Jared brought up earlier, it's too subjective from one person to another. It's like the moisture meters. I mean, we all, one person can feel pretty good about using a knife or a soil probe, and we're at a good moisture content. But if I take one and you take, we're all going to have a different opinion, and that type of exercise evolved into, every golf course pretty much uses soil moisture meters because they can manage to a number. Well, with clipping yield, it's maybe not as critical, but a similar thing in that we're just going to have a different perception of so empower your staff around you to collect that data and use that data to make decisions. I mean, there's so much topic about, so much discussion about mental health these days. It'd be nice to empower your assistants and such to make some decisions, and you don't have to be there 7 days a week making those decisions. So there's something to be said about that as well.
So we touched on this a little bit with respect to green speed data, and obviously that has gotten to the point where a lot of courses are compared to one another based on what the perceived green speed is. And when we look into clipping yields, a couple questions really for the group. Number one, do we think it's practical to be able to compare clipping volumes or clipping yields from one course to another? Superintendents talking, they talk a lot about different moisture meter numbers, but those don't seem to travel all that well. So lots of variables that are going to impact those clipping yields with mowers, agronomic plans, grass types. First question, do we think it's practical to compare those numbers? Do you think superintendents would actually maybe benefit from learning, hey, what's my tip? What's your average clipping yield? I mean, in our platform in Deacon, we've got the ability to sort of report out clipping volume per 1,000 square feet. So we could compare them. Would superintendents benefit from that?
I think the general discussion, yes, but the reality is you've got to figure out what works at your particular golf course. I mean, at the end of the day, we're trying to grow as little grass as possible to produce the best surface. I mean, the less the grass is growing, the better it performs, throughout the day. But every golf course is different growing environments, different amount of play, different grass types. So I think for the sake of a healthy discussion on how a golf course can get better, yes, but as far as direct comparisons, I don't think so. I don't think it would be, but it can definitely get people thinking on how they can improve. Absolutely.
I agree with Jared said. He has 4 greens that are always different than the rest on his golf course. So how are you going to compare another golf course that might have different species or varieties or different percentage of organic matter in the soil? And if you've got different percentage of organic matter in the soil, your soil volume moisture is going to be different, and so your moisture levels might affect the growth. Different nitrogen carriers or programs that you're doing. So yeah, that's
Different.
It's a great thing to have other courses do the same thing, but know that they're their own unique thing.
Certainly be interested to you take that out further when comparing maybe not necessarily golf courses but markets. If you, like you said, with Deacon, and you have potentially everything in ounces per thousand, it's like, well, in the upper Midwest, this is a trend. We see this range, and then obviously for Florida or Georgia or where there's comparing it to or not comparing it to Ultradorf, but not comparing cool season to Ultradorf, but looking at Ultradorf markets and stuff like that. Not sure if there would be, but it would certainly be interesting to look at to help maybe give some better advice for a superintendent that was looking to start. Say, hey, this is a range you may want to target, and then go from there.
Yeah, I could see if you moved into a different region or switched grasses and kind of had if there was an aggregator sort of this is typically where we fall with the Ultradorf green in the summer, or this is usually where we end up with in the summer for a pole bent green or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Of course, in Vegas, Adam, they have fans on their greens, and so they click clippings every day. But when the fans are running, the surfaces dry out, and their clipping yield is way less than when the fans are not on. So it's like, and they've done it enough that they know that that's coming. But again, to share from one course to another is tough. I think you have to dial in what's at Euro. And we just talked about green speeds. Green speed targets are so different from one course to another. So it's got to be something that you figure out at your own facility.
Another one for the group. So intuitively, fewer clippings you would think would result in typically faster green speed. But is that what you guys are seeing, or have you noticed any trends there that sort of line up, or is it's still too early to tell? You've got to grow some grass, obviously.
Yeah.
The trends on my golf course is the more grass I'm taking off, if that bucket is full, the ball is going to roll much less. The ball roll is going to be a lot slower. So the goal is to get enough clippings to where you have good plant health, a good surface, but not enough clippings to where you're seeing a negative impact on your stimp or your putt.
I'd agree that in general that is true. It's interesting though, we do, as agronomists, we do 2 or 3 championships a year, and some of those courses we're collecting clippings, quantifying clippings, and obviously we're measuring green speeds on every green twice, sometimes 3 times a day, and sometimes clipping yield doesn't necessarily translate into the green speed. So for example, we'll go to a U.S. Open type of golf course where the clippings are like this in the basket, and yet we're still losing 18 inches, 24 inches of green speed from 6 a.m. to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Say, well, it's growth. Like, really? I mean, we're not having a lot of clippings on the green. So it in general, I agree, but it's not black and white. I would say there's some things that we just don't understand, to be quite honest.
Well, there's a phenomenon where, I've actually seen where you start keep cutting. We just kept cutting one day, and all of a sudden, when you start hitting those 4, 5, 6 cuts, your stem goes the other way. They started to slow down. It's just a weird phenomenon, but once again, you start to learn things when you write them down.
So John, thinking from turf research, I think it can and should be a two-way street, and in most cases it is. But as a researcher, if you had really good averages on some of these things around clippings or average fertility inputs, for instance, how would that help you plan research, or what are some of those things that you'd really want to know when you're thinking about some of these things from a research perspective?
So from a research perspective, it's definitely a two-way street, because no idea is a new idea, and that's what's the beauty of this industry is superintendents are really creative in what they're doing, and through trial and error, and I've learned a lot, and we brought up Rodney Lingo earlier. With his Greens Perfection brushes, he changed the industry for mowers, because he said you had to use the Greens Perfection brush and it could only do a counter rotation. And he did this just based off of his things, and at that time it was only one of the mower companies had that, happened to be green, and they only had the counter. So we did that research based off of what Rodney said, and we looked at and we compared counter versus forward rotating brushes, and we did it on bent grass and we did it on Bermuda grass, but this is based off of what he was seeing, and we found that it didn't matter if you did forward or counter rotating on bent grass, but it did on Bermuda grass, and the counter did give you a more yield of clippings picked up when you did the counter rotating versus the forward. But he also got the other companies, the orange and the red ones, to change that you can now do counter and forward and counter rotating, because they were always forward.
Yep.
So I think it's definitely, the research is a two-way street, and all I did was go and validate what Rodney was already saying about his brush on Bermuda greens, but also showed that it was different on bentgrass greens, so you didn't need to do that counter. You could do the same with the forward rotating. So yeah, it's definitely a two-way street.
So Jared, you've talked a lot about how you've had this data for many years, and you've presented it with the decision makers at your course, using things like the auto-generated graphs that we have in Deacon, for instance. I think that's a really neat feature to use this data as a communication tool. How else are you using this data, from a record-keeping perspective?
Yeah, so The data that I use is very much in that PowerPoint presentation for the stakeholders, the green committees, my GM, and I get all those numbers and I try to boil it down to the simplest terms possible. Just like with the USGA, when you don't want to present all the numbers, you don't want to say how you got there. You want to just show the trend lines, and using graphs and tables is what I use very frequently, just so that they can see where we're headed. I never just post a number. If you just post one number or one data set, they don't know if it's good or not. You got to have the previous months or previous years to see, are we going down or up? And I use it for everything. I know we're talking about surface management, but how many people look at organic matter? If you're just punching your greens or needle tining or whatever you've decided to do just year over year, and not having any idea if your organic matter is going up or down, I mean, are you doing the right thing? Are you doing what's necessary? And I don't know about your golf courses, but aeration is a big deal at mine. They don't like it. They don't want to do it. They don't want to putt on open holes. And you need to be able to defend, is your organic matter trending up or down? And be able to show, we aerified twice and we lost ground. We need to do a third one. Or, hey, you know what? We're doing okay. Let's back off in aeration. Let's give you the golf course for that month. So anyway, it just goes back to giving the data to your stakeholders so that they can see it, understand what you're doing, and really back you up and get behind you, behind the team and what you're trying to accomplish.
A couple wrap-up questions for the group. So, this one's there's a fair amount in here. So, I guess the ultimate is data collection here to stay? You talk to obviously someone like you, Jared, who feels pretty strongly about it. Chris Trittabaugh is another one that he has gone and said that collecting clippings and tracking data is his most important greenkeeping metric. So is it here to stay? Do you think, I look at it, there's some similarities to the moisture meter in terms of, hey, we were managing moisture pretty well before we had the moisture meter. But once we got it, it became commercially available, it was affordable for so many golf courses, and we just were able to sort of pinpoint how much more we could fine-tune our greens and our moisture. So do we think clippings and data collection is here to stay? Do we think it's going to have sort of an adoption at some point like the moisture meter, or are we looking for maybe a little bit more of a long-term trend where people slowly adopt?
It may not be for everyone, but it's definitely a growing trend, and more educational sessions like this, and just the pioneering superintendents in each area that demonstrate the value of data collection. It's a trickle-down effect, right? Some of the best courses, and I will say this, of the courses that I work with that are routinely collecting data, they're all really good. Now, I'm not saying you have to collect data to be really good, but there's definitely a theme with these golf courses that are doing this routinely, is they're producing phenomenal conditions at a really high level day in and day out. And, they would tell you that this is part of that process. So, any course I work with, I would suggest, look, keep it at a simple level, one green, take the clipping yield, take a stimming reading, and just do that every day or even every other day just to get started. But one green isn't that bad. It's not that time consuming. And just be upfront with them that, look, it's going to take some time for this data to mean something. To your point earlier, Jared, it's weeks, months, and then courses now that have done it for a few years, they look back, and you said this, Jared, the patterns are similar every year. So it's like, wow, gosh, my green speed slowed down in May on an ultra-dwarf green. I know that I'm going to ramp up my growth regulators and maybe some vertigrooming earlier so I can manage that before it even happens. And those are the kind of things that are really impactful over time.
I agree. I think it's here for the long. I think it's here. It's definitely going to be a trend that continues to grow, and more people are going to do it. We're seeing it in you see it in sports with advanced analytics and the success of those organizations there. But I think to Brian's point he made earlier in the talk, where he's seeing significant reduction in nitrogen inputs. There are courses I work with bentgrass greens that are applying around a pound of nitrogen for an entire year. I remember when I started working on golf courses, it was 4 to 6 pounds. I mean, that's a significant reduction in inputs at some of these golf courses, and it's not a coincidence that those are some of the highest performing greens I see in my travels. You know, it's not, you know, it's just, it'll take time, but, and it'll continue to grow.
As a researcher, it's always all about the data, right? So we know that. So I think golf courses, superintendents that are collecting all that data, it's a great tool and it's a great resource to go back on to justify why you're doing what you're doing on your daily management practices for everything, like you'd mentioned. So if you had to cut something out, well, this is what the repercussions are going to be, and this is what the data is going to show. And I agree. People were pretty good at water management before the TDR probe, but 9 times out of 10, when I first got to Tennessee going to golf courses, people were overwatering. I don't see people overwatering anymore now that they're using the TDR probe. So that's data that has changed for the benefit big time, and that's a huge thing that I've noticed over the last 20 years that have, you know, one of the most improvements in putting green management is not being overwatered because of that. But now getting more data collection from the clippings and using this, I mean, yeah, like they're the highest quality greens, like Brian said, that they're probably out there that people have.
I mean, millennials make up, I took a class yesterday, millennials make up 52% of the labor force in the country. And you start looking at that, and then you got Gen Z coming behind. I mean, these are people that we're all working on our phones. Everything's through our phones and technology, and trying to find ways to incorporate technology into everything we do. And that's the labor force coming, and I don't see this going away. I think that it's going to become simpler. The applications are going to be out there, be developed, that it makes it much easier on a daily basis to do and take the data and put it together, and then you're going to have all these applications for it. I just don't see it going away. I think technology is taking over our industry because, I mean, older people in this room were doing a great job 30 years ago. We just have more tools available to us now. They're very different. Technology's changed. And so it's incorporating that green thumb with your data to create something really, really good.
So last question here, and thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the road with data collection, what do we think the next key piece of data is that maybe we don't do it very often now, but it's going to be the norm in 5 or 10 years? Is it firmness? Is it something else like smoothness or trueness?
Well, one thing that I don't see often quantified is sand top dressing. You brought up organic matter management, and other than water and mowing, I mean, I think the most important part of greens management is managing surface organic matter. And we're developing, the USGA is in the process of doing some research to develop a standardized method for that. But going along with that, I think quantifying sand top dressing, and then would ultimately smoothness and firmness. I don't know if you want to touch on the smart ball, Adam, but the USGA has a prototype ball in the works where we're hoping to quantify smoothness and firmness. We're excited about that.
To Brian's point about quantifying the amount of sand that's applied, Chris Triplex and Michael Woods did an excellent podcast where they talked about really managing organic matter in the top 0 to 2 centimeters of a putting green. And if you've got 2.5 hours that you want to kill talking about the top 2 centimeters of a soil profile, I highly recommend it. But there's a lot of good points to take away from that, and about how Chris makes an attempt to, or Chris and Mike are working to determine how much sand he needs to apply to maximize the performance of his greens. And yeah, I agree with Brian. If we're talking smoothness, trueness, and firmness, there's a great way to measure and track that. Those would be the next data, or the next metrics or data points we'd be looking to collect and record.
Yeah,
Awesome.
we've never been able to measure smoothness accurately, right? It's a subjective determination.
In my opinion, that's the missing link.
Yep.
That's still the subjective putter right now.
Yep. No, great insight, guys. Really appreciate it. It's been an awesome time talking with you on this panel. I'd encourage anyone in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free. We'll all stick around. These guys can certainly talk about data collection and service management all day long. So thanks again for your time. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Adam.